ideologies that overtake European lands. So what he's basically talking about are political economic systems called capitalism and communism. And when I read this, I was kind of taken aback for a second because I hadn't really thought in the framework which he was thinking about. And we'll go into some of these quotes. But what his basic argument is that the West has developed these material ideologies where humans only exist as an economic factor. And what could it look like to use Islam to transcend the economic framework as being everything? So these are some of his quotes in the book. Some of our people are being indoctrinated with the philosophies, dogmas, and rituals of materialistic faith, but the majority of Muslims in Africa and Asia are still confused and disturbed. They have known for a long time that they have a faith, a revealed law, a society, and principles which call for a state that is neither secular nor theocratic, but possibly both, and that is neither autocratic or demagogic. Muslim society is based on freedom of the individual and the equality of everyone. Muslim society is the essence a classless society. It is classless not on a basis of an economic theory, but on the basis of its egalitarian laws, and its refusal to recognize distinction and honor except through piety and submission to revealed law, whose fundamental principles are universal, humane, and democratic. Nothing that is preached by the East or West is new to the Muslims. And one more thing he says, I refuse to believe that human destiny and history are ruled and determined by a class struggle for a system of wages. They do not believe either that classless society on a material basis will be the fulfillment of history or of human destiny. The pretension that the eternal universe is planned for such an economic theory or for a higher standard of living is incomprehensible to the Muslim mind. Of course, he's waxing and waning in general terms. And he's offering critiques to both capitalism and communism as playing in this dance around materialist ideologies. And then he says something interesting. The spiritual and material forces of life must achieve an equilibrium in which the former directs the latter towards the general welfare in accordance with the duty laid upon many by the Almighty. So keep your eyes on that, balancing spiritual and material. This is Malcolm's reflection months and months later in September, and we'll go into how he comes to this. When we learn to think as human beings instead of as capitalists, communists, and socialists, this will then be a world for all human beings. You know, there's this dispute, especially in Life of Reinvention, the biography that I mentioned that Manning Marable had written, but in many segments of society around what Malcolm was at the end of his life and where he was going towards. So Sunni Muslims want to own that he was going towards transcending race through Sunni Islam. Socialist and militant labor strugglers want to prophesize that he was heading in the direction towards socialism. And then there are those who saw him as fulfilling the stamp that he became in America, becoming part of multicultural liberalism. So I rarely hear anybody saying that he's transcending systems. And this is more support for the fodder. He talks about the world of brohood, of Islam, brohood, security, common bond, hospitality, warmth, love. Love is important for Malcolm. And he says, must blend material and spiritual to build a better world. I mean, clearly he is reading and putting into action some of the things he is reading. And then he says, these are his observations about being in the Arab world. The moral strength or weakness of any country is quickly measured by the attire, and this goes to this blending of spiritual material. The attire and attitude of its women, especially the young. Lebanon is a good example, and so is UAR, which is the United Arab Republic, which was Egypt and Syria, compared to Arabia. Material progress seems to destroy spiritual values. If these two, material and spiritual, could be properly balanced, paradise would then exist. So clearly, after he reads this book, he's grappling with these two concepts and what would it look like to blend things. And it's not lost on him that even a form of nationalism is part of this material sort of struggle. And he's trying to figure out how he can advocate for a revolutionary Black nationalism at a time he's thinking about the spiritual oneness, this tawheed. So frequently, again, people have this Disney cartoon narrative of Malcolm going to Hajj, and then all of a sudden, what happens? What happens?
He renounces violence.
Right. He renounces violence. What else? Colorblind, right? These are his very words in a letter from Hajj. He says, so we know this one. The brotherhood, people of all races, colors from all over the world coming together as one, which proved to be the power of one God. This gave me an opening to preach to them a quick sermon on American racism and its evils. I could tell its impact on them, and from then on, they were aware of the yardstick I was using to measure everything. For me, the earth's most explosive evil is racism, the inability of God's creations to live as one, especially in the West. So for him, he is linking up this idea of oneness and tawheed being disrupted by racism. So it is a Muslim's obligation to fight against racism and to not say that when I become Muslim, I am indeed just inducted into this kind of consciousness and thinking. So this is how he's trying to think about instrumentalizing Islam for the Black freedom movement. He's saying, I could look into their blue eyes and see that they regarded me as the same brothers because their faith in one God had actually removed white from their mind, which automatically changed their attitude and their behavior towards people of other colors. Their beliefs in the oneness had made them so different from American whites that their colors played no part in the mind, in my dealing with them. And he continues, if white Americans could accept the religion of Islam, if they could accept oneness of God, of Allah, they too could then sincerely, one second, oops. Oh no, my notes. There we go. They too could sincerely accept the oneness of men and cease to measure others always in terms of their difference in color. So the way that Malcolm was actually looking at the power of Islam as dealing with the cancer of racism was its effect on white people and their white supremacist consciousness. It wasn't necessarily that now blacks have to get rid of their notion of race. And I think that's a big sort of flip in the way that the autobiography, As Told to Alex Haley, we sometimes forget that it's As Told to Alex Haley, narrates what impact this experience had on Malcolm's thinking around race and race consciousness. So this is not the first time he goes to the region. So the Spike Lee film, the autobiography, makes it seem like this is the first time that he sees Islam in action. Yes, the Hajj is an incredible experience that you can't take away the power of what it's like to see people from different parts of the world come together and be part of this spiritual dynamic movement. But he went to the region and connected with some of the very same people. He mentions that he met one of the people at the Islamic court and remembered him from 1959. And he mentions 1959 a lot. And so these are some other entries. This is another interesting one. Islam and Sudan for Malcolm. Have you heard of Malcolm X's relationship to Sudan?
No.
Yes, hands raised, not raised. Malcolm had a very particular reverence for the way that Sudanese people practiced Islam and how Islam was practiced in Sudan. He went in 1959 to Khartoum and Omdurman, and he was, in an exchange he had in a newspaper called the Pittsburgh Courier, which is also a black press in the US. He was debating with a Sudanese guy who tried to challenge his connection to Islam because of his affiliation with the Nation of Islam. But Malcolm surprisingly says, in 1959, I was in Sudan, in Khartoum, and Omdurman. I also visited Muslims in Nigeria, Ghana, Egypt, and Arabia, but none of the people anywhere impressed me like the people of Sudan. They seemed very pious, very hospitable. I really felt at home. And as you notice, again and again, when Malcolm is giving you a picture of what impressed him, what do you see? Hospitality, spirit of brotherhood, friendship. It's how he's embraced. Because for him, it is a direct challenge to the way he feels constantly marginalized. As we talked about, how do people at the margins think about what the colonial experience is like? How it felt to consistently be marginalized in the US. And here are some of the other Sudanese people he meets. Ahmed Asman, who was a student at Dartmouth. I love him just like I love my own brother and the wonderful people who are in Sudan. Then another man who was a professor at American University of Beirut, Malik Bedri, he saw in 1959. He saw in 1964 when he was in Lebanon. And they carried quite a correspondence. And Malik Bedri has reflected on his meetings with Malcom. And he even called him, he said he reminded him of Maududi, who's an Islamic thinker. And Sheikh Ahmed Hussoun, when Malcolm X was given an opportunity to be sponsored by the governments of Saudi Arabia and Egypt, he requested that he get a sheikh from Sudan. What was that?
No.
About Maududi? Yeah, we can go in detail about that. That's why I was, there's some granular moments.
Anyway, carry on.
Yes, yeah. Oh no, we can go into that too. So he requested a Sudanese sheikh. So the Sheikh Ahmed Hussoun came over to the States, and he actually remained even after Malcolm passed away, and he led Malcolm's janazah, his funeral. This, to me, was perhaps one of the most interesting findings. We talk about Malcolm X's revelation at Hajj, but like I said, he had documented how he saw people of all colors, all races at Hajj. But he also mentioned in his diaries people of birds of a feather flock together, which was an interesting comment about how he didn't see people interact with each other. And so he saw something different in the summer, that same summer, in August 2nd, 1964 in Alexandria. He was invited to speak to this group called Shaban al-Muslimin, which was a group of 800 Muslim students, and Malcolm says there were 73, 74 different countries represented in this group. And he was so impressed that he was greeted with, what did he say? Youth from everywhere, face of every complexion, representing every race and every culture, all shouting the glory of Islam, filled with a militant revolutionary spirit and zeal. And this is some of his notes that he was going to give, that he gave at this celebration. So Sadna is the celebration of the Prophet Muhammad's birthday. And then later, he says that this trip impressed him more than what he saw in Hajj and was more revelatory for him. Have we ever heard about this? No. And as you saw there, he talks about Gamal Abdel Nasser. Although we can dispute whether Gamal Abdel Nasser is a figure within pan-Islam, Malcolm was very moved by Gamal Abdel Nasser's construction of what he calls three circles, which were concentric overlapping circles of identities: Pan-Arabism, Pan-Africanism, and Pan-Islamism. And so this is what helped Malcolm grapple with how to blend the spiritual and the material. What was that? Oh, sorry, I get easily distracted. But Malcolm was very moved by Nasser because he did see a rigorous challenge to not only American hegemony, but the bipolar universe. Egypt at the time, if some of you don't know, was part of the Nine Aligned movement. So they played a politics of neutrality in an effort to leverage the Soviet and the US to play up against each other. And that put them in a position to have more power than in a hegemonic world where there's one power at play. And so Egypt became, Gamal Abdel Nasser's Egypt became not just a center for Pan-Arabism, but also for Pan-Africanism. So Gamal Abdel Nasser hosted the Organization of African Unity's second conference that same summer, and that's where Malcolm is reflecting on some of these things. And in a newspaper article in the Egyptian Gazette, we'll go into this later, these are some of the comments that he also has. He says, "Your president is my president, a man fearless, far-seeing, uncompromising on the side of freedom, supports African freedom fighters," and Gamal Abdel Nasser did. He provided safe haven for exiled African freedom fighters and supports freedom everywhere. And this is what he said. He said that Gamal Abdel Nasser was so right when he said that there are three circles: the Arab, the African, and the Islamic. And he was interviewed for this article, and the interviewer said Malcolm X himself is the personal friend of many African leaders and irritates Americans by talking of my president, meaning Gamal Abdel Nasser. And so these three circles come from Gamal Abdel Nasser's book called Philosophy of Revolution in 1955, 3 years after the military coup that he led against the monarch, Farouk. Oh, so I should set this up because this is the doozy of it all. How many have heard of Malcolm X's trip to Gaza? Exactly, I was just going to jump into it and not tell you. So Malcolm, as I said, is he takes 2 trips to the Middle East and Africa. There was his first Hajj trip. He comes back to the States for a little bit. And then he stays from July all the way up into November, like 19 weeks, going back and forth between Middle East and Africa, but spending a lot of time in Egypt. And this is the summer where the Organization of African Unity's conference is happening. And also the Arab Summit is happening at the same exact time. And who's coming to the Arab Summit but the PLO representative? So the Arab Summit conference is being held in Alexandria. Organization of African Unity is in Cairo. This is a breakdown of Malcolm X's trip to Gaza. And we're going to start to see why I did the Ummah imperative lead up into this. He visits Aswan province. Oh, so at this time, Gaza is under the control of Egypt. This is before the 1967 war where Israel takes over Gaza. Malcolm X, in his diaries, comments that he visited Arab refugee camps, dined with one of the colonels, and then this is my favorite part. He had an evening with a Gazan poet named Harun Hashim Rashid. And this poetry was so influential to Malcolm, and I think I have it in one of my next slides. He reproduces a stanza from this poet's poem in his diaries. And it's interesting because it just, like I said, his diaries are something you have to go through and decipher. There are notes, there are daily outlines, there are people's addresses, but there are also things like the Harun Hashim Rashid stanza that goes uncredited. So how would you know who this guy is? This is him talking about the 5 to 6 days he spent. This is the poem. And Rashid is talking about having fled the Khan Yunis massacre in 1956 that took place in Gaza at the hands of Israel, clearly. We must return, no boundaries should exist, no obstacles can stop us. Cry out refugees, we shall return. Tell the mountains, we shall return. Tell the alley, we shall return. We're going back to our youth. Palestine calls us to arm ourselves. And we are armed and we are going to fight, we must return. So what does Malcolm do with all this? What does he do with everything that he's witnessing? What does it mean for him to embody the spirit of brotherhood that he is seeing happen with the way that he's being treated as a Muslim? He starts thinking. Palestine reminds him of places and things. That Spain was colonized Morocco, so Moroccans came from Spain. Indians from America. These are the colonial sort of productions. And Negroes came from Africa. And Arabs are indigenous to Palestine, and Israelis are indigenous from Europe. And so he makes this construction, colonialism, imperialism, Zionism equals racism. This is in his travel diaries. He's thinking, but what does he do with what he's thinking about? So he meets the PLO chairman September 15th, 1964. At the time, the PLO is only in existence very recently, and he writes about meeting Ahmed Sukari. We don't know what happened. He doesn't say more than that he poses for pictures, but he produces this. September 17th, so he had just went September 5th through 6th. He produces this op-ed that he writes for the Egyptian Gazette, which is an English language paper in Egypt that comes out of Cairo. And actually, there are some African-American, Black American expats that work for this newspaper, and that's a whole nother story. And in this, he says, this is a prior thing. He equates Zionist dollarism as a 20th century imperialist tool. It's their number one tool. And remember I showed you bird, horse, cripple, hypocrisy? It's this. They crippled the bird's wing and then condemn it not for flying as fast as they could. So he's talking about the way that Zionist logic plays out as a legal argument, as a moral argument, and how unfounded it is, but also how it critiques the colonized for not flying as fast as it does after they have been crippled by the colonialism. And in the same piece, he brings up this exact construction and uses that to argue against Zionism, that Zionism is no different than imperialism, colonialism, and racism. These are some quotes from it. If the Israeli Zionists believed their present occupation of Arab Palestine is the fulfillment of predictions made by their Jewish prophets, then they are also religiously believe that Israel must fulfill its divine mission to rule all other nations with a rod of irons, which only means a different form of iron-like rule, more firmly entrenched even than that of the former European powers. More firmly entrenched. This is him after a 2-day visit. This new kind of Zionist colonialism differs only in form and method, but never in motive and objective. So he is continuing, like I said, to think about this and thinking about it through the lens of material and spiritual. This is from his diaries, which happened a week or so after he wrote that op-ed piece. It takes some of the same poison to counteract, same as antidote poison. Europeanism has been such a strong poison for centuries, it now becomes essential to emphasize Africanism to counteract it, Arabism to counteract Zionism, socialist to counteract capitalism, Orientalism or darkism to counterbalance Occidentalism or whiteism, thus the present escalating world struggle. So I don't know if he ever arrives at what this looks like beyond a moment of systems that are nationalist informed, that are trying to be in dialectic opposition to colonial powers. But this is where Malcolm is, September 24, 1964, and pretty consistent for the last remaining months of his life. So as you can see, that trip really influenced him. He's still talking about Zionism. This is his last interview with the newsletter that I told you about called El Muslimin. He wrote his final answers the day before he was assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom on February 21st, 1965. So February 20th, he wrote this. Zionism is even more dangerous than communism because it is made more acceptable and is thus more destructively effective. So why did I lead up to you very detailed retelling and re-narrating of Azam Pasha's argument around communism and capitalism? Because Malcolm doesn't think too highly of communism himself. He sees Zionism as more dangerous. So that is in some way indicating that he doesn't think communism is an effective solution. The colonial vultures have no intention of giving up without a fight. Their chief weapon is still divide and conquer. In East Africa, there's a strong anti-Asian feeling being nourished among Africans. In West Africa, there's a strong anti-Arab feeling. These hostilities are not initiated by the above-mentioned who are involved. They have nothing to benefit from fighting among themselves at this point. Those who benefit most are the former colonial masters who have now supplemented the hated colonialism and imperialism with Zionism. And so if you're thinking to yourself, is Malcolm writing all this stuff about Zionism, critiquing Zionism, and possibly trying to jockey up some sort of support from Arab, from Gamal Abdel Nasser's Egypt, from Saudi Arabia? Is he just doing this as a political expediency move? In this same article, Malcolm actually critiques Arab Muslims for not living up to their brand association with Islam and for trying to reach out to the Black Muslim community and Black Americans to support their struggle. So even within their press, he's critiquing them. And even within his diaries, he's talking about how much he's critiquing Arabs to their face. He says at numerous times, remember I read you that quote that after Hajj, he took this opportunity to preach about the evils of racism. He consistently brings that up. It didn't happen just after Hajj. It happened throughout his 19 weeks abroad after he had come the second time in 1964. He is constantly in conversation with his brothers in the faith around what is really happening. And Malcolm X is seeing himself as somebody who is testifying to the horrors of what's happening to Black Americans. So this didn't go away with his induction into, quote unquote, traditional Sunni Orthodox Islam. It was empowered by the teachings he was learning from the Islam post-Nation of Islam. And we could talk a little bit more about that. And I might just, and he also talks about the fact that he had conversations with Arabs about the slave trade, Arabs and African involvement in the slave trade in a Saudi press. But I think I'll end on kind of a funny note. This is one of Malcolm's critiques of Arabs. He says, the Arabs are poor at public relations. They say inshallah and then wait. And while they are waiting, the world passes them by. The Hajj is Islam's best advertisement, and in parentheses he says selling point. If the Hajj alone were properly pictured to the outside world, taking first into account the psychology of the outside world, that's a whole nother discussion we could have. He says that in parentheses. Millions of converts would be added yearly to the Hajj, after the Hajj. So I'm tying this all up to basically give you a view into the world of what Islam meant for Malcolm after the Hajj. So we just really kind of went towards the end of his life, and how it was very much informed by the embodiment of the ethics of Islamic liberation. And at the heart of that, like I said, is this ummic imperative of being treated like a brother, like a sister, not just in faith, but as a human. And for him, that practice, which he frequently experienced in his friendships, as we went over, was the basis for how to deal with American racism. And I don't think many people have used the radical decolonial Islam that Malcolm is thinking about to understand how he was using it in his fight to internationalize the Black American struggle for human rights in the US. And that's what I'm leaving you with, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions.
We'll take 3 questions at a time. Yes, the gentleman, Ali. Ali Murtada. اسمك علي؟
Same thing.
Oh, Ali al-Murtada.
Spirituality and religion, they're almost used synonymously. What was Malcolm X's feelings about spirituality, and how did that shape also the religion of Islam, and what about the spirituality?
So Malcolm is also in this period trying to think about what he was taught in the nation and learning a new set of rigors, let's say, right? There's a different kind of rigor that the Nation of Islam presented, which one was you could only eat 1 meal a day. That was part of Elijah Muhammad's first book, Eat to Live, I believe it was called, and getting used to the 5 prayers every day, and getting used to eating more than 1 meal a day. There is moments of him thinking through the religious sort of components, but overwhelmingly, I do see that the spiritual grappling, right? Not just, for me, the way that he thinks about brotherhood is hits at the very heart of the spiritual message that he's getting from Islam. And even more so, you see him reflect about what this time has given him. So what I didn't bring into this presentation that I was debating about invoking was he had comments about Mecca and Medina, and I found them very fascinating. So he basically narrated Mecca as kind of this fast-paced city, and you could almost see what 7th century Arabia still looked like. And then Medina for him, he said, was incredibly serene. And he said that he actually hadn't experienced that much time to himself to think and to be free of distractions since his prison days. So it was an interesting quote, because it was not like prison is a time to valorize, right? But it reminded him of having this moment to just think and sit with his thoughts. So there are times in his diaries where this comes up, and there's this famous quote with of Malcolm's that's also in the autobiography, where he says, when you're with Allah, Allah gives you signs, right? And as we know, practitioners of Islam, we talk about signs, ayats, all the time as the language of the divine. So he is parsing through that sort of spiritual language and experience.
Just a quick aside, one of the fascinating memories that I had when you were just talking now, as a child, I heard many pilgrims, when they come back and they narrate their pilgrimage stories, them recounting how they found Medina they seem to be more at home, more calmer, more attracted even to Medina than to Mecca. And it's a nearly kind of heretical thing to be expressing, but I remember it was routine, the pilgrims coming back with this kind of message.
Oh, it's consistent. It's absolutely consistent.
Yeah. Anyway,
Yes, sorry. No, I was just going to. It was funny because I was going to mention.
Mecca is the big place that you're going to, and then people come and they come back and they just feel that their hearts. They left their hearts behind in Medina.
Right. And Medina was this place of refuge for the Prophet. So if we kind of think about also the idea of refuge from his persecution in Mecca, that there is some sort of analogy for a lot of people of what like a space of refuge feels like. And that's how I kind of think about the same narration I hear from almost everybody that comes back from the Hajj is exactly that.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much. It was good living from Ken. My things are quite mixed up. The Fanon influence or the African and Negritude movement influence on whether there was any. And then of course the context is that while what was happening in America, something else was happening in Africa and the Middle East. There were anti-colonial struggles, and that's where the Ikhwan and Maududi and them come in, right? These anti-colonial people, reformists, Islamic reformists and so on, they, and what kind of influence was there on Malcolm from that regard?
Right. Fascinating. And, when I do this presentation in the future, I think I'm going to really focus a lot more on the Pan-African Islamic elements, which I didn't do here as much, especially when he's traveling through Nigeria, being presented the Quran at a ceremonial government meeting in Accra, and different elements of Pan-African Islam that Malcolm was building with. And in terms of African diasporic relationships he was making, he did meet with President African in France. He went there when he made his only trip. The second time he was trying to go to Paris, he was not allowed into France. And he actually wrote to the Secretary of State explaining what happened. But he did build with the Negritude movement and with decolonial Caribbean thinkers as well. And that I talk about that a little bit in my dissertation, not to disavow his relationship also with Pan-African thinkers who were centering communism and socialism in their work. And Ikhwan and the Muslim Brotherhood. So this is quite an interesting sort of moment that Malcolm X becomes a martyr. He is building relationships, financial relationships, political relationships, religious relationships with the state of Egypt and Saudi Arabia. At this moment, they're at proxy war with each other in Yemen. They're at international war over their brands of Islam that they're outsourcing, right? Nasser is centering Al-Azhar. Saudi Arabia is deep in its exportation of Wahhabism and Salafism. And as a result of the repression of the Ikhwan in Nasser's Egypt, he's connecting with Ikhwan figures in Geneva, Saeed Ramadan. He's connecting with them in Saudi Arabia. He's connecting with them in some of his travels. So I wonder what it would look like if he did live, the fact that he has developed relationships with people who are fighting amongst each other, and political tension that's actually very dangerous. But that's the only way he was figuring out how to, one, piece together money and support for a movement that he was trying to start in the US. They were willing donors, the Muslim World League in Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Supreme Council of Affairs in Egypt. But he also had this interesting comment that his secretary wrote, I believe, to an Egyptian diplomat that Malcom was trying to figure out how to unite the two. Some of his Saudi friends and some of his Egyptian friends.
Abu Bakr? Thank you, Dr. Alhassen. You know, what came to mind was something about when you said about Gamal Abdel Nasser, which kind of triggered the relationship between him and Sayyid Qutb.
Yeah.
And they, I mean, they took pot shots at each other, and they one was jailed, and eventually found that one of the so-called idea of Islamists was then killed in jail.
Right.
I juxtapose that with South Africa in the sense that 1994, in my opinion, we had a liberal democracy, in the sense that it created peace. So people can't seem to sit down. I mean, in terms of what you're saying about decolonial, Malcolm X was really talking about a new system which was relating to having peace and justice, in a sense that it's not relating to Islam, but that all human beings can then understand how we can talk and work with each other. Clearly, the two Muslims could.
Right. No, for sure. Well, which is, clearly. I think in the sense that I'm thinking about decoloniality is the way that Professor Farid framed it, which is, what does it look like to have consistent disruption and critique to prevailing systems, right? So it was, I was taken aback by Malcolm's admiration for Nasser and how deep it went, and also an admiration for political elites in Saudi Arabia. But we also have to understand what it's like to be a Black American Muslim traveling around that world. And he even makes the specific comment that he was honored to be served in these palace-like places he was staying. But it was just because it was a different kind of treatment than he had ever experienced in the US. So I think Malcolm is rummaging through a lot of contradictions that are happening. He visits the Aswan. He says nothing about Nasser's displacement project of the Nubians in the Aswan. So there's question marks happening, but we have to think about, like, what does it mean to travel on this mission around different countries and experience the world differently. We were just having a conversation that being a Muslim here is completely different than in the US, and this is day 3 for me, and I'm starting to navigate and figure that out. But does that mean that this place is heaven, right? You know? Right. But those are the things that you have to deal with in terms of the contradictions of just existing in your body in different places. And that's what I mean about, like, Chea Sandoval's relationship or her argument around decolonial love, the embodiment and the articulation. It's not just the rhetoric that we have about it, but we have to deal with what it looks like to have our bodies exist in these spaces.
Yes.
Hi. Jazakallah khair for the lecture. I really appreciated it. Just to take a step back a little bit from the academics, I wanted to find out, A, how did you actually gain access to Malcolm X's diaries?
Okay.
And B, what did it feel like? How did it feel to be so intimately and personally connected to Malcolm in his own words in a way that, like, most of us don't really have that kind of access to?
Oh my God, I have a story for you, and I can't believe I deleted this slide. I cannot believe it. Okay, you're gonna find out about me. Summer of 2008, the Malcolm X family decided they would allow the Schomburg Schomburg Library in New York, part of the New York Public Library system, to make those files accessible. So they're on microfilm. You can go in, I think you just need an academic affiliation now. Sometimes they've changed a lot of the restrictions or added more restrictions and limitations than they did initially. And so the first time I went there, there were no restrictions and there was really no oversight. I don't even think I had to sign a form explaining what microfiche I printed out. But now you have to state every single microfiche you printed out. You can't, I think there's a certain percentage of the collection that you can't have more than like 30 or 70%, something like that. So they've been adding restrictions. So I was actually living in Los Angeles. I had moved back from having done my master's at Columbia on the project, but I just took a trip out just to see the collection. I printed out everything. I sat there all day. And so I was rummaging through microfiche after microfiche. And in his Saudi section, I see somebody named Yassin. Yassin is a fairly common Arabic last name. It's my mother's maiden name. But in the context that it emerged, it was telling. So my mother's side of the family actually has Saudi citizenship. My parents are from Syria because a relative from another generation had fought in the Great War in the 1930s in Palestine on the side of the Palestinians and was known as a great general. And at the time, the Saudi monarch created a council of Arab advisors. And so he picked somebody who was my grandfather's uncle to come and advise him on foreign affairs. So what did he do? What all of us do, all us brown people do. He brought all his nephews and his brothers to be part of the Saudi government. Nepotism wasta. I figured out who are the Arabic speakers. So my grandfather, I learned, was part of this Saudi diplomatic machine. He was a cultural attaché that was reassigned every couple of years. He was in Ghana. I learned he was in Ghana at the same time Malcolm was in Ghana, and he actually did meet him. I learned posthumously because he never shared that story with me. He passed before I was able to have these conversations with him. But then there was this guy, Nawaf Yassin. I was like, I've never heard of Nawaf. And I ran out of the library, because back then you couldn't have your phone with you. Now they can't separate human beings from phones anymore. So I called my mom and I said, do you know a Nawaf Yassin? And she said, no, that doesn't ring a bell. And I was like, what? Dang. So then a couple years later, I go to a wedding in Damascus and I start talking to somebody I realize is kind of the oral historian of the Yassin family. And I mentioned, I just happened to think maybe she'd know. Do you know somebody named Nawaf Yassin? And she said, yes, he's my uncle and he lives in Beirut. I was like, what? I found out he was the deputy protocol minister of Saudi Arabia at the time, so he was taking Malcolm everywhere. So I interviewed him, and he remembered Malcolm vividly. So I had a slide in here where I showed you him mentioning Nawaf Yassin. And it's so bizarre to have a connection with Malcolm that continues to reveal itself. So yeah, so you can access it. Maybe you have the connection too. You never know.
Farhana.
My question kind of also is in the space of contradiction.
Yes.
How did Malcolm, using his Ummid praxis, how did he deal with the issue of gender? The issue of gender.
Gender. So as you saw, he kind of had this, this kind of paternalistic understanding of like sometimes people tout this around as like a liberated Malcolm on gender, that like you judge a society by the way women dress and their attitudes and how well educated they are. And while that's all well and good, it is kind of paternalistic. And actually I would point you to Farah Jasmine Griffin, who has written about this, and her article is called Ironies of Sainthood. And she investigates the way that women have valorized Malcolm. But there, again, a lot of contradictions. So Malcolm did keep company with incredibly radical, brilliant women of color. As I said, Grace Lee Boggs, who just passed away very recently. If any of you don't know her, she is a stunning thinker in socialist thought, in organizing, in even beyond the system of socialism, and thinking through the power of local organizing. She's a Chinese American woman who produced a lot of thought. Yuri Kochiyama, Japanese American woman, also revolutionary thinker. Like I said, Vicky Garvin, who lived in Egypt and Ghana and China. And Queen Mother Moore, who was also a Black feminist communist. This was his circle of people. But the irony was that the men in Malcolm's life were the ones who betrayed him. And it was the women who stuck by him. It was the women who he ended up putting in positions of leadership because they consistently were there for him. The reflections that women had about Malcolm in that time period were, they were amazing. Like, you listen to or you read what Maya Angelou used to write about in terms of her meetings with Malcolm and her work around trying to create an organization of African American Unity branch in Accra when she was there. And then there was another thought I had. So Black Lives Matter, movement for Black Lives folks now have been narrating Malcolm and his importance to Black women as him having been a martyr for Black girls. And how does this make sense? So their reading of Malcolm is that Malcolm, his critique of Elijah Muhammad's relationship with his secretary, some underage, and trying to hide that, and trying and being in exploitative relationships got him into the hot water that it ended up being grounds for his assassination. And he stood up, and I want us to really think about that, because I always encourage my students to see history in the present moment. What does it actually look like to critique somebody who does harm to women, especially Black women, right? And these are the conversations we're happening right now. We're talking about things that happened in the past, right? And this is a stunning moment for me to watch the emergence of Time's Up, Me Too. But for Malcolm in his time period, that was a really radical thing to do. So yes, contradictions all over the place.
Could you just speak to Farid's comment about decoloniality as a kind of a process and a method that is ongoing versus FJE and these kinds of objectives that Malcolm is trying to attain? So what is his actual, his means of opera, what is his method, what is his way of thinking of doing things versus achieving things? So decolonization versus decoloniality.
There were various stages, right? So he mentioned the psychology aspect. Remember when I talked about the account of psychology of the outside world? So this is something he still retains from the Nation, which is the Nation produced a really powerful tool for decolonizing mental slavery, right? And for them, what was really important, and for Malcolm, what was really important was affirming the beauty of Blackness. Addressing the psychological damage that colonialism does. And so the reason why I think he's bringing this up in this moment is that there's a scholar who I work closely with, his name's Zahir Ali. He talks about the Nation of Islam as a process of socially engineering a new people. And that's why he accounts for this idea of the nation slowly introducing things that might seem foreign to Black American population. And so Malcolm is speeding this up, right? Malcolm is actually seeing this marriage of Islam and radical, revolutionary Black nationalism as pushing forward this decolonial process. So I'll explain. He had started the Organization of African American Unity to mirror the Organization of African Unity. This is in its infancy. He's building people up. This is March 1964, so less than a year. He is in Egypt trying to get people to start a branch there of expats. He is in the US trying to organize people around this. Like I said, there are women leaders in this movement. In fact, there is a woman, oh my God, I can't believe her name slips me. A very important woman. She later becomes part of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She was a part of Organization of African American Unity, and she's the one who brought Palestine to the table for SNCC. And SNCC very famously produces a newsletter in 1967 that condemns Israel for the war and condemns Zionism. So there are people that are moving through the orbits that he is creating that are also having an impact and influence. But he is creating institutions. He is creating the Organization of African American Unity. At the same time, he's building the Muslim Mosque Incorporated. So I think he is trying to grapple with what does it look like to deal with the spiritual and the material and having them be in conversation with each other. And to this end, he is producing these organizations that eventually are going to build a Muslim base in the US, linking up to a global Islamic network, and then an organization, African Unity, that is building with Pan-African leaders and groups, and going to take the relationships that he makes in the dark world to critique, not critique, but charge the US for the treatment of Black Americans at the UN. So he's pulling these pieces together, and we're looking at the timeline of this. This is like a year's time. My interest is how he's arriving at these ideas through this framework of an umic imperative. And I don't think we always have the answer to what things look like, but he's parsing out these worlds through institution building, through philosophizing, through building friendships. I mean, like I said, I argue that the politics of friendship within a political structure is a very decolonial act, actually. And the way that he's thinking about it through the spirit of brotherhood is also very interesting and is kind of a decolonial Islamic spin.
Ila Baker? The lady's name is Ila Baker? Was her name Ila Baker?
No, not Ella Baker. I think it's Eleanor. I'm gonna have to think about that. She's very rarely written about. She's one of those figures that we need a biography for.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
I don't know if this is a question, just some ideas that I'd be very happy to get your comments on. So recently, the movie The Black Panther has been breaking records, and it's interesting to see the kind of appropriation of the label by Hollywood and the characterization of Africa in the American mind. At the same time, there have been a whole lot of documentaries on television on Tupac Shakur, and his mother had been a member of the Black Panthers, and he kind of has this gangster liberation element. And to juxtapose all of that with Malcolm X, I'm just wondering what thoughts or comments you might have on all of that.
Okay, so I haven't seen Black Panther. I've read some people's comments, and I'm actually going to see it here, I think on Friday. So that should be interesting. Anybody want to be in conversation with me post-Friday? We can do that. But my understanding is Black Panther came about as a comic series, actually at the same time around the same time the term Black Panther comes to prominence. So the term Black Panther is produced from Laurens County in Mississippi before the Black Panther Party in Oakland takes that term. So there is some historical alignment around this term. But when we talk about the Black Panther Party, and obviously Tupac being very influenced because his mother was a part of the party, his aunt, Assata Shakur, was a part of the party and the Black Liberation Army as well. I always talk about how the Black Panthers consciously saw themselves as children of Malcolm. And if we think about today, with the Black Lives Matter movement, I don't know if I'm going all over the place, but one of the most popular figures for them is Assata Shakur, actually. And at the end of every rally, or at the beginning, actually mostly at the end of every rally event, everybody comes together and they chant lines that were in her autobiography. We have a duty. Oh my God, how do I forget this? I chanted this so many times. We have a duty to fight for our freedom. Who's?
We have a duty to win.
We must love and honor one another. We have nothing to lose but our chains. So this is how they close out everything. So I think people are conscious, especially within the movement for Black Lives in the US, about Hollywood's interference, but also there is a conversation around the power of black futurism and what it looks like to imagine a universe of a non-colonized African space. So that's all I know. I haven't seen the film, but those are discourses I've been hearing from afar.
Okay, thank you very much, May. Can we give May a round of applause?
Thank you all. Thank you for allowing me to share this.
Thank you very much. I'll just have a few words of thanks in a moment, but May, a little gift from the department for you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you
It was
so
wonderful
much.
listening to you.